Great Responsibility, Chapter 44, Aftermath. There was a moment's confused silence before a groan broke the tension caused by the arrival of the S.H.I.E.L.D. director himself. All eyes in the room turned to Piper, who stirred, her eyes flickered open. The normally clear blue was glassy and out of focus. She tried to move and groaned. Bruce laid a hand on her shoulder.
"Stay still. You got hit bad, Piper. What happened?"
She didn't seem to hear him. Instead, she groaned again and tried to sit up. Harry, where's Harry? Clint let go of Harry's arm. The boy clumsily raced forward and knelt at Piper's side.
"I'm here. Piper, you need to listen to Dr. Banner. You're hurt. Oh, God, is she gonna be okay?"
This time he was talking to Bruce. Before the doctor could answer, Piper moved again, groaning as she did. Her hand came to rest on his, and he shuddered at the warm blood that dripped from her skin to his.
"Are you okay?"
Harry nodded, brushing a strand of hair out of Piper's face, for once not caring that her father was standing right next to them. She smiled at him, and her eyes slipped closed, her hand going alarmingly limp in his. He sat there stunned for a moment before Dr. Banner called out to Captain America. "Steve, get over here now. We need to get her to medical. Now!" Captain America, still in full uniform, gently pushed past Harry and scooped Piper up, racing out of the room as Jarvis lifted the quarantine. Harry stared after them for a minute before someone gently laid a hand on his shoulder. He looked up into Nick Fury's one good eye.
"You can't do anything for her right now, but we can make sure that Venom is really gone this time."
Harry nodded dumbly, looking back over at the door Piper had just been carried through. Fury guided him to his feet and helped him over to the hole in the wall where a shield craft was hovering, medical personnel waiting inside it. Once Harry was in their capable hands, Fury turned to the team.
"You dumbasses went off the res. You are in so much trouble tonight. You are going to be running drills for a month straight."
Tony stepped forward.
"Wait, these are yours?"
he said, angrily gesturing at the group of teen heroes. Fury nodded.
"Yes, and they were supposed to be doing a simple patrol in the area, not messing with things way too strong for them."
Fury was lying. The teens knew that, but it wasn't like they would tell Iron Man that. Iron Fist stepped forward and bowed.
"My apologies, Director Fury. But we saw what was happening and decided to lend our assistance."
White Tiger piped up from where she stood slightly behind Luke.
"To be fair, it was Nova's idea."
Tony raised an eyebrow.
"Which of you is Nova?"
There was silence for a moment before Nova tentatively raised his hand. Tony stepped over to him and looked him up and down for a moment before holding out his hand to shake. Nova stared at it dumbly for a moment before Power Man elbowed him in the side, and he reached out and took it, shaking it.
"I'm glad she wasn't alone. Thank you. You've got potential, kid. S.H.I.E.L.D. ever gets too shady for you, you give me a call."
Tony turned, and the armor folded off of him, and Nova saw that the tremor he'd felt wasn't from the armor. Tony was shaking. He fumbled a phone out of his pocket and hit a button before putting it up to his ear.
"Pepper, I need you at the tower. Please hurry."
There was a pause.
"It's Piper. She's hurt."
Another pause.
"You figured? How? What do you mean, check the news?"
Tony walked out of the room quickly, and Natasha, Clint, Thor, and Nick Fury were the only ones left. The S.H.I.E.L.D. ship with Harry in it had already taken off. Clint spoke for the first time, his voice shaking slightly.
"What the hell happened here? Somebody tell me before I shoot something."
The teens pieced together what they could, but they knew they didn't know the whole story. The only person who knew for sure was Piper, and she was in no condition to talk to anyone right now. Clint nodded at them as they finished.
"All right."
With that, he stomped out of the room. The widow sighed.
"Thank you for helping her. We do appreciate it."
With that, she followed Clint out of the room. Fury sighed and motioned for the team forward. A second S.H.I.E.L.D. craft landed in the hole in the wall, and they boarded the jet. The ride back to the helicarrier was silent. When they landed, they all lined up on the bridge, waiting for Fury to dole out their punishment. Fury sighed.
I gotta say, I wasn't expecting her to be this good of an influence on you lot this fast.
They all frowned, looking at each other confused. I'm sorry, sir, I don't understand. Aren't we in trouble? Fury shook his head.
Yes, but only because none of you called to report what you were doing. What you did, going after her, that was the right thing to do. You did good. Now go get some rest. It's been a hell of a day. I have a mess to clean up.
Nova stepped forward. Sir, I was wondering, something Mr. Stark said before he left the room, something about checking the news.
What was he talking about?
Fury sighed again. He turned to one of the consoles and tapped a few keys, pulling up and unmuting the Bugle News. Shock rocks through New York today as years-old rumors come to light about one of our local heroes. Tony Stark has a child! An image of Piper flying away from Venom, her face in shadow, but the gloves and boots were clearly visible. Who is this mystery teen? Where has he been hiding her all these years? Who's the mother? More of this at 10. Fury closed the news and turned back to the teens.
There's gonna be a lot of backlash from this. Get some sleep, you'll need it.
They nodded and walked out of the bridge, off towards their respective rooms. Tony paced back and forth in the waiting room of the medical wing in Stark Tower. Any sound from the room within was drowned out by the sound of construction from 2 floors below. The tower would be fixed soon enough, but there was a mob of press waiting outside for a statement about what had happened. Natasha had popped by and explained what little the teen team had known about the situation, but that hadn't been much. S.H.I.E.L.D. had whisked Harry Osborn off, and that meant he was most definitely involved in all of this. Pepper was on the phone, putting out fires with the PR department, but her hands were shaking too bad to use her Stark pad properly, so Natasha was helping her with that. The Russian would occasionally glance up at the doors to the operating room, but never spoke or moved other than that. According to Jarvis, Clint was in the firing range with Thor, destroying the place. It was self-repairing anyway, and if Tony hadn't been so worried, he would have joined them. But he couldn't focus on anything but the image of his daughter's face. Blood flecked on her face, her lips split, and the gashes in her side. He shuddered as Pepper finally stood, hanging up the phone. She wrapped her arms around him and held him close for a moment. He felt himself sob into her hair. Chapter 45. Consequences. Harry sat in the room in the medical wing that the medical personnel had dropped him off in, staring at his hands. Piper's blood had dried there. He was beginning to wonder if he'd ever get rid of that feeling. There was a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and a bottle of water sat in front of him on the table. He hadn't moved since he'd been told to wait here. What had he done? He couldn't remember anything after Piper had used some of her dad's tech to blast Venom. Him, he supposed, off his feet, and brought the roof of the closet in on his head. He vaguely remembered hearing Piper say something, then pain, and he was waking up next to her. He'd told the agent who'd come in to question him that. She'd been nice. Agent Hill, she'd called herself. She'd left him the water bottle. He sniffled, and tears fell from his eyes. He heard something going on out in the hallway, and a med tech slipped into the room and smiled at him slightly.
Hello, Mr. Osborn. My name is Penny, and I need to take a blood sample. We want to make sure that the parasite that took you over is completely gone.
Harry nodded. So they were calling Venom a parasite. He couldn't think of a more appropriate name. The tech had him hold out his arm and gently drew some blood before smiling slightly and laying a hand on his shoulder.
Are you feeling all right, Mr. Osborn? Do you need anything?
Harry couldn't bring himself to shake his head. He wasn't okay. He wasn't sure he'd ever be okay. He'd hurt Piper. The parasite, the symbiote, Venom, whatever they wanted to call it, it had made him hurt her. He wanted to bury his head in his hands, but he couldn't. He still had her blood on his hands. The med tech grabbed an antibacterial wipe from her kit and began to wipe his hands clean. She smiled at him when she was done, her black hair falling into her eyes slightly. Harry didn't manage to smile back. Bruce sighed and pulled off his rubber gloves. He tossed them into the biohazard trash can. You could never be too careful when it came to radioactive blood. They'd had to sanitize the whole lab. They'd have to sanitize that whole lab or risk radiation poisoning. He made a note to himself to have Jarvis sanitize it as soon as possible. He looked back over at the bed in the room and sighed again. Steve laid a hand on his shoulder. He was wearing scrubs over his uniform. It made for an interesting sight. Bruce would have laughed if it hadn't been for the circumstances. The monitor beeped away slowly.
We need to let the others know,
Steve said, pulling off the scrubs and depositing them in the same trash can Bruce had put his gloves in. He looked down at the blood on his uniform and frowned. Bruce cleared his throat.
You're gonna want to get that sanitized. Radioactive blood doesn't come out easily.
Steve managed a small smile.
Go let them in.
Steve nodded and the doctor left. Bruce adjusted the oxygen mask slightly. Eddie frowned. He tried again. Again, the phone rang through. He swore under his breath and tried again. This time, he heard something. Piper's ringtone was obnoxious. He'd told her that the other day, when she'd gotten a call while they were working on his computer. It was a loud, slightly shrill pop song. Her excuse had been that she never missed a call with a ringtone like that. He pulled his phone away from his ear and listened. He followed the song to Piper's locker. It was just in front of the currently roped-off area where the fight had gone down. The whole school was going nuts. First, a rumor was spread like wildfire that Spider-Girl went here. Now Tony Stark had a child, and she went here too. Eddie was starting to wonder how much of that was coincidence. He spun in Piper's locker combination and stared at her backpack for a minute. It had to have been her flying off then. She never left her backpack anywhere. He snagged it and spotted something sticking out of the corner. He frowned. Why would Piper have a red shirt in her bag? He paused for a moment before curiosity got the better of him. He looked around for a minute. He was alone in the hallway. Then he tugged on the tiny corner of red fabric. He dropped her backpack in surprise as it finally came free of what he now realized was a secret compartment in Piper's backpack. He stared down at the mask in his hands, the white eyes staring back up at him. Spider-Girl's mask stared up at him. He suddenly found it very hard to breathe. He had to find her as fast as he could. Mary Jane was panicking. She couldn't get a hold of anyone. Harry's phone was going straight to voicemail, and Piper's was just ringing through every time. She wrung her hands. They had been in the closet, the one that had been torn apart from the inside. They had to be okay, though. They just had to be. She tried Piper again. This time she heard her obnoxious ringtone sounding around the corner. She raced around it and found Eddie with his back to her. "Eddie!" He jumped nearly a foot into the air and stuffed something in his jacket pocket as he turned. He was holding Piper's bag. MJ frowned. "No sign of them?" Eddie shook his head.
No, but I think we both know where they went. I don't have a passcode to get in, though.
MJ frowned. "I do. No ride." Eddie nodded.
I have a spare helmet. Think we could make it through the thongs of press that have likely gathered around the building?
MJ grinned.
"I know one of Piper's private entrances. It's about 3 blocks away from the tower itself. We should be able to make it."
Eddie smiled and zipped up his pocket.
Come on, then. Let's go make sure our idiot friends are okay.
MJ nodded and grabbed his hand, leading him out of the school.